Welcome to tonight's Patricia H. Labalme Friends of the Library lecture. I want to thank the New School, our hosts, and in particular, Lucille Tenazas for our being here tonight. There will be a short question and answer period after the talk. The Friends of the Library lecture is first recorded as having been given in 1977, the Common Era. Among those who've delivered this address are Salvatore Settis, Anthony Grafton twice, Chris Chalenza, Stephen Greenblatt, Peter Brown, Mary Beard, David Kurtzer, Hal Foster, Lena Wertmüller, Shirley Hazard, Richard Wilbur, William Weaver, and Gore Vidal. Caroline. After the death of Patricia Labalme in 2002, her family endowed this event. So a word about her. Patricia Labalme received her MA from Bryn Mawr in 1948 and her PhD from Harvard in 1958. Her dissertation was later published as Bernardo Giustiniani, a Venetian of the Quattrocento. She edited the volume Beyond Their Sex, Learned Women of the European Past, published in 1980, which was a very important book in the history of women's history. She taught at Wellesley from 1952 to 59 and Barnard from 1961 to 77. She was an adjunct at Hunter College in 1979 and taught similarly at NYU off and on in the early 1980s. She moved then to the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where she was the associate director from 1982 to 88 and held other leadership positions there until 1997. She was a trustee of the American Academy in Rome from 1979 to 1999, no term limits back then. And as a trustee of the Gladys Kriebel-Delmas Foundation, she created the Venetian Research Program, from which so many of us in this room, I suspect, including myself, have benefited. Just another personal note, I'm personally honored and kind of chuffed in an uncanny way to be able to do this introduction because my mother was her friend and classmate at Bryn Mawr in 1948, and then as chair of the history department at Hunter, invited her to do that visiting gig in 1979. Now, tonight's lecturer is Caroline Goodson, Mellon Professor in the Humanities at the American Academy in Rome, moonlighting from her day job as Professor of Early Medieval History at Cambridge. Caroline has a BFA from RISD in printmaking, a PhD from Columbia, from the Art History and Archaeology Department, and has a specializzazione in metodologia archeologica from the Scuola Interdisciplinare di Metodologia Archeologica in Bordighera. And as you'll see if you don't know her work, archaeology plays a major role in her thinking. She's taught first at Birkbeck at the University of London from 2005 to 17, and has been at Cambridge as a fellow at King's College ever since. Her books, first, Rome of Pope Pascal I, 817 to 24, published in 2010, and most recently, Cultivating the City in Early Medieval Italy, also Cambridge, published in 2021. She's edited, along with others, a number of significant volumes. Titles are Cities, Texts, and Social Networks, 400 to 1500, Experiences and Perceptions of Medieval Urban Space, that was 2010. Graphic Signs of Identity, Faith and Power in Late Antiquity and the Early Middle Ages, 2017. And very soon, sometime later this year, if the gods smile, a companion to Rome, 400 to 1050, a giant collected volume. She's published articles in many journals, including Early Medieval Europe, the Mélange de l'École Française de Rome, and Past and Present, and is on the editorial board of Speculum and the series editor of the Oxford series in New Medieval History, and is a faculty member of our collegial, not even frenemy, friends, the British School at Rome. Now, Adam Smith, in Book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, makes the point that the normal course of economic development draws the wealth from the countryside to create cities, but that in Europe, because of the impact of Rome's fall, that economic conveyor belt was broken. And when it was restarted, after the Crusades, especially after the beginning of Venetian and Portuguese maritime expansion, it privileged long-distance trade in luxuries over close-in trade in staples. Everything you needed to know about the subsequent course of European history, Smith suggested, arose from this, his words, unnatural, and retrograde motion. Now, Goodson's book is an intervention in this long debate, part of a contemporary pushing back against a received view, received, in fact, since Smith, that ruralization is the antithesis of urbanification, that cities are the engine of political, cultural, and economic growth, and that more of the rural means less of the urban, with all that follows from that. And she ends her book, the most recent book on cultivating the city, by posing 4 interesting questions. The first, what would an environmental urban history of the early medieval city reveal? Second, how can we characterize the experience of the unbuilt? Third, must we use the tools of analysis of the built environment? Fourth, was the cultivation of food an unspoken part of the daily grind of getting by, or was it culturally noble? These are big questions, and they resonate today in very powerful ways. Just as a side note, one of our fellows, Gary Hildebrand, at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, did an exhibition with his students last year on urban forests as a future project. So there is a back to the future element here. But also, just because all history, like all politics, is local, and as we are reapproaching, as we would every year, Galileo Week at the Academy, marking the night in 1611 when Galileo brought his telescope to Rome for the first time and demonstrated to a small group of friends in a villino on the Gianicolo that happens to be in our Sid and Mercedes Bass garden. It's important to recall that the entire hillside on which the Academy now sits was then a vineyard, and that the Villino Malvasia, where they observed that night, sat amidst an agricultural park. And with that, it is my great pleasure to invite Caroline Goodson here to deliver this year's Patricia H. Labalme Friends of the Library lecture.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you all for coming. One of the things I'm most excited about in terms of giving this lecture here in New York is to talk about cities with people who really know cities. I want to talk about urbanism. I like working on cities. I'm interested in cities, and I'm interested in the problem of cities. I'm interested in how people come to invest in and make cities and make them endure. I'm also, as you've just heard, really interested in Rome, and a lot of the things that I like to think about are whether Rome is exceptional or totally normal in the early Middle Ages, whether Rome, being the biggest city in Western Eurasia, was something that was just good luck, or whether that it was the sort of most perfectly achieved form of a city anywhere, or whether it was just really typical and we could probably find similarities elsewhere. And I go back and forth on thinking about the answers to that question, but it's I'm going to not answer it today, but I'm going to try and situate Rome and its problems of archaeology in a wider context. So a lot of the things I'm thinking about when I ask these questions about people, plants, and animals in cities, I'm thinking about with Rome, but I can't answer with regard to Rome because of the way Rome was excavated in the 19th and the early 20th century. But this will, I think, all become clear momentarily. I'm going to start with bears. Between the 4th and the 13th centuries, about at least 55 bear skeletons were thrown into pits or rubbish tips or trenches in cities across Italy. The vast majority of these are in Rome. And in the same period, 15 bears are in rural sites, quite a lot fewer. Of the rural sites where we find bear skeletons, the vast majority are rural castles, so elite settlements. Bears were used for entertainment. They were hunters, and they were hunted in Rome's spectacle games. So when Symmachus planned the Praetorian Games for his son's appointment in 410, he drew upon a network of friends across the entire Mediterranean, across the empire, to provide animals, including bears from Dalmatia. Bears were pretty middle range for Symmachus. He had antelopes, gazelles, crocodiles, leopards from other corners of the empire. 50 crocodiles apparently died en route to Rome because they refused to eat in their ship. But by the later 5th century, so a little bit after Symmachus, not even 100 years after Symmachus, leopard and antelope and crocodile, these were no longer part of the spectacle. But bears endured. They clearly remained a key part of urban spectacle in Rome and elsewhere. Bears lived in the woodlands and the mountains of Italy, of Dalmatia, and of Northern Europe. But they came to be urban animals in medieval Italy, intended for show. So when Lombard officials in the 10th century were displeased with the abbot of Monte Cassino, he was taken from his monastery to a nearby city, dressed up in bearskins, and chased up and down the streets by dogs. So bears weren't wild and ferocious animals, they were entertainment animals in that context. They were captive entertainers for city folks. In the Liber Politicus, which is a text that's written in the 12th century reflecting a series of performances that happened in Rome of earlier centuries, they tell us about what happened at Carnevale in Rome. And at Carnevale in Rome, before the Pope, 3 animals were slaughtered. A bear, a rooster, and a bull. The bear, we are told, represented the devil and temptation, and so its slaughter meant those were expunged for the purposes of Lent. The bull was pride, and the rooster was lust. So bears in the medieval imagination of Italy and Rome in particular, they weren't just entertainers and entertainments, they were also wicked, and their death was instrumental to morality lessons. So thinking about the changes in locations of bears reflects shifts in economies. Only through the commercial, transport, and long-distance social networks that characterized the Roman Empire could men like Symmachus easily acquire crocodiles for urban games. European animals would have to do after the 5th century. These bones attest to a persistent desire to enjoy the thrill of killing an animal, of exerting men's power over the animal, and ultimately men's power over other men. Cities provided the theatrical spaces for this display, and men of means, whoever they were, they're the ones who could afford to stage them. Bear remains from castles come from bear skins, probably, that were hung on walls or laid on floors as trophies of bear killing. So looking for these remains helps us to see where displays of power took place, and thus where centers of authority resided. Now, within any city, people interact with one another in their urban landscapes in ways that are fundamentally different from interactions outside of cities. What makes them do so is harder to answer. The New Yorker has made a weekly magazine about this very issue since 1925, with an entirely unique genre of comics and illustrations which are centered on New York City and the interactions that are peculiar to this city, to living in apartments, with rats, with pigeons, with trees that are covered with plastic bags, etc. And so if there is a particular ecology of New York City that's manifest in both material and in text, then I wonder, might there too be ecologies of cities in the early Middle Ages? Michael E. Smith, who's a Mesoamerican archaeologist and thinks about pre-modern urbanism in a comparative perspective, he calls the phenomenon of urbanism in the ancient and medieval past, energized crowding. His aim is to show that orthogonal planning or consistency of officials' titles, those are not the things that made urban culture, but rather relative scale, relative density of people, and specialist production. Those all had economic and social effects that gave rise to urbanism. And he wants us to consider the choices and the accidents that gave rise to urbanism and sustained it or prompted its abandonment. For the early Middle Ages, much of our understanding of how this works is centered on empire. So the fall of Rome meant the end of cities, The rise of the caliphate meant the creation of new cities in different places, which is, kind of true depending on where you look and how you're looking at it. But what underpins that kind of thinking is the idea that cities are created out of consensus. There are top-down building projects by a king or a bishop or a caliph, and the construction of a collective urban identity around a saint's cult or the collective assemblies for governance. Those are the things that made urbanism in the Middle Ages. And it's true, densely populated settlements of any scale rarely emerge without significant investment from political structures. These are expensive. They're laborious to make and to maintain. And they also make wealth and they permit new forms of living. There are benefits to that kind of investment. But the more work I do on early medieval cities, the more I think that a better way to think about them is as places of diversity. Places which existed because of the mix of different forces, of different kinds of people, of performing different functions, and of different species. The cities of the early Middle Ages that we know about now, Rome, Milan, Constantinople, Córdoba, they're places with more than one economic or social center of gravity. They were polyfocal, with bishops and courts or monasteries. They weren't just cities made up of islands, which is the term that Italian archaeology tends to use for medieval cities. Those different islands did different things. People in early medieval cities identified as different from one another by religious community, by affiliation with a particular cult, by nationes, that is the sort of place of origin, by their neighborhood in which they lived, by their profession. The animals that were consumed in different parts of cities were often certainly different from those that were consumed outside of cities, and often different from one neighborhood to another within cities. And dense human settlements like cities attracted certain kinds of wild animals that don't appear as frequent in other contexts. So we can think about rats, we can think about house martins, we can think about certain kinds of owls, which appear to us in the archaeological record almost exclusively in urban contexts. Domestic production in cities could include pigs and chickens. Everywhere in medieval Europe consumed some mix of cattle and pig and goats or sheep. But the different proportions reflect different local food strategies, different wealth hierarchies, and different uses of those animals. And the very soils of cities were different because of what happened in cities. And so therefore different plants grew. So this evening I'm using this idea of ecology as the strategies of coexistence of human and non-human life. And also, and I want this to be a lens for considering how the experience of living in cities shaped social interactions, to think about early medieval cities and the role they played in the formation of medieval societies, cultures, and economies. And I want to think about animals, plants, and stuff. What was different in cities? What possibilities did those differences create? How much was top-down, and how much was bottom-up? So let's get to what everyone's thinking about, rats. Urbanism in Western Eurasia since the Iron Age has brought with it commensal animals, including, of course, the black rat, which colonized Europe from Southwest Asia, probably overland, in the 1st century BCE, 1st century CE. Clearly expanding along with the Romans, with their ships that were filled with delicious wheat and barley, with their grain houses, which were heaving with stored cereals across Europe and North Africa. Rats went along too. And as the commercial economy of the Roman Empire abated in the 4th and 5th centuries, so too the likelihood of finding rats in the archaeological record decreases. Despite the fact that we know that early medieval cities had great stinking piles of rubbish and kitchen waste, and we'll hear more about those momentarily, we don't tend to find rat bones. Michael McCormick pointed out 20 years ago that as late Roman cities and their stockpiles of grains in warehouses dwindled, and communication between cities also dwindled, so too rat populations declined, at least as far as the archaeological record can tell us. Now, a new project funded by the ERC and led by David Orton at York uses mitochondrial DNA from excavated rat bones to consider the overall patterns of genetic relationships across Asia, Europe, and North Africa. And that project can demonstrate a second colonization of Rattus rattus, that is a black rat, from Central Europe in the 8th to the 10th century and onwards, after a period of considerable population collapse. So it's not there were no rats, but they're very, very, very hard to find. And very clearly, the DNA tells us that there's a new wave of rats that comes through Central Europe at the end of the early Middle Ages, towards the turn of the millennium. There's been another large-scale survey of rat bones that charts a 5-fold increase in black rats across Europe in the 11th century. That's markedly greater than a similar increase in other small rodents like water voles or voles or mice. So urbanism doesn't always foster rats, but urbanism on the rise, with good connectivity to other urban centers, along with the stockpiling of grain, somebody has to control a large amount of grain. Those are the conditions that provide that rats like. Now, Romans had weasels to control rodents, mice and rats. But in late antiquity, you don't see so many weasels. We see lots of cats. Incidence of cats increases with the incidence of rats in the late Roman urban environment. People are clearly keeping cats and also little terriers in order to control rodent populations. There's a very, very different stature of dog that you can find in the archaeological record in late antique cities with respect to what you can see in the countryside. If you think about a Yorkshire Terrier versus a German Shepherd, that's kind of scale of difference is what the archaeological record attests about what people are keeping in their house. They may have loved their dogs, they may have kept them as lap dogs, they may have given them nice names, but they were certainly also commensal with humans and also eating the same thing that rats are eating and chasing away rats. Now, one of the clearest archaeological signatures of the early medieval city is dark earth. This is an archaeological context that's formed of domestic waste, hearth, ashes, and manure. That term, dark earth, appears in 1912 in English to describe the deposits that sat over top of the remains of Roman London, which you can see on the left there. Terre Noire has been recognized in the early medieval layers of French cities since the 19th century. In European urban archaeology, that term has historically connoted deposits that were dark in color, with little obvious internal stratification, with few inclusions or inclusions that were highly abraded, including brick, tile, charcoal, bone, and pottery. So that means it's things that have been turned over, little bits of things and things that have been turned over. And I hope you can sort of see that in these images that I've given you here, one from Tours and one from London, where we've got this sort of huge deposits of very, 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 very consistent dark earth, literally, over top of which are medieval structures that have cuts and walls and different kinds of internal stratigraphy. Now, since the 1990s, geologists have been using petrological and chemical analysis of the components of these soils of dark earth, including minerals and archaeobotanical elements, to reveal the diversity of the contexts. And they are revealing the formation processes. So historically, people understood these big packs of dark earth as colluvial or alluvial deposits, which sealed the Roman layers of a city by natural accumulation, a site that was left undisturbed by use. In the British context, that means after the end of the Roman Empire, when the Romans all go away, and before the migration period begins. It is true, we know from examples in London, from examples in Berlin, that sites that are left unbuilt since the Second World War have accumulated significantly thick deposits. So in Berlin, you can get contexts of 20 to 25 centimeters in urban areas that are simply left undisturbed by use. So that's how people understood these things in the past, until people started doing this kind of analysis. So what we can see now is that geological, man-made materials, and plant remains, they're identifiable chemically. they make clear that numerous and varied transformations occurred successively or concurrently to make dark earth. It's not abandonment at all. So we know about this from the case of Tours. Tours is a place that we know a lot about in the early Middle Ages. Gregory of Tours wrote about the city when he was a bishop in the 6th century, and then we know about his successors after that and their descriptions of these major monasteries and major shrines there. And archaeology has revealed a city stretching along the Loire River, growing out of its Roman framework into a really busy early medieval city, right? So I showed you deposits there from Tours, from Prosper Mérimée, and here I'm showing you a schematic plan of the evolution of Tours in the Middle Ages. Outside of the walled Roman city on the right, across the banks of the river, and into this complex around the shrine of Saint-Julien, which was the major pilgrimage center at Tours. So at Prosper Mérimée, a series of stratified deposits has been analyzed petrologically to determine what that dark earth stuff is. And there we've got people living, discarding their hearth waste, their night soil, they're trampling the soil consistently over time, they're keeping their animals near their houses, and around the famous shrine of Saint-Julien and at the Episcopal Center of the former town, we've got similar kinds of profiles of different kinds of activities. So what produces dark earth in this case, and in nearly every case, is not the abandonment of Roman period buildings and their decay, nor the alluvial or colluvial accumulation of sediment because of disuse, but we've got people, their stuff, their garbage from their house, their manuring that they're using as fertilizer, and their gardening, their horticulture, their trash, and their gardens. Now, these kinds of deposits are ubiquitous in the archaeology of early medieval cities. They've been, and we can see them where we've got stratigraphic excavation over the past, 30, 40 years. We can see them in London, we can see them in Tours, we can see them in Tournai, we can see them in Mérida, we can see them in Córdoba, we can see them in Florence. Here's an example here. Now, the manure and ashes that are identifiable with thermoluminescence, which is what you're seeing on the right from samples that were taken from the dark earth samples in that middle image there. In the case of Florence, makes very clear that dark earth is made up by poop. Lots and lots of poop. There are distinct components to the poop of omnivores, like humans and pigs, and herbivores, like sheep, cattle, goats. And there's a very distinctive high phosphate signature for bird dung. And each of those we can see in different contexts, and they appear differently under thermoluminescence. They make clear how many urban animals there were, how common it was to have animals in city and their poop. Pack animals, of course, brought grain and produce from the countryside to feed the city, and they provided transport for high-status travelers. At Rome, we know that the Pope rode in liturgical processions on a horse. He walked alongside groups from different neighborhoods in the stational liturgy of Rome, but he was riding a horse. Pigs were the most eaten animal in all of the post-Roman world, in the countryside as well as in cities. In cities, they were bred. We find skeletons of fetal and neonatal pigs in the rubbish tips of several cities. We must have had animals running free as well. Butchery waste suggests that domesticated animals were often butchered inside cities, right? They weren't brought in as meat. They were butchered in cities. They were brought in on the hoof. And cities attracted wild animals, which were brought partly butchered or often partly butchered and consumed, like deer, for instance. The ashes that go into these deposits of dark earth as well come from hearths, they come from kitchens, they come from artisans' workshops. Everyday objects could be made nearly everywhere. This is what people did in the early Middle Ages. They made homespun cloth, they made hand-built pottery for cooking and eating, they made wooden spoons and iron nails and pots. But specialist products like glass, like wheel-turned pottery, and like fine metalwork, those were made in professional or semi-professional, often urban workshops. In Iberia, in Spain, we've got glass workshops identified in many late antique cities, Cartago Nova, Ronda, Amaya, Valencia, Seville, but these more or less shut down in the 6th century. as glassworking becomes an activity that is very closely attached to the court of the new royal city of Recopolis before the mid-7th century and the Vega Baja of Toledo. It may be, and I think this is the case, that the use of highly sought-after raw materials, like gold, like silver, like gems and glass, they were controlled by the king and the court, which were based in these cities. There's a 7th century Visigothic law that refers to a group of servile goldsmiths that were operating under a royal official who was located, and they were located near the palace at Toledo. And I think this stands in for a practice that was widespread. These workshops produced ashes from kilns and forges. They had made smoke, they made waste from metalwork, but they also made prestigious jewelry worn by elites throughout the kingdom. And you can see a couple of examples here. We often find these brooches here in rural cemeteries, but and that's because people dressed their dead in fancy garments for burial in a rural context, but they were worn in cities, and they were almost all made in cities, courtly cities. Those ashes were made by groups of artisans, and the presence of artisans is another typical feature of early medieval cities. At Thessaloniki, workshops clustered around a main street. We have an account, a letter from a priest, John Caminatis, who wrote of the city's capture by the Muslims in 903, describing the streets lined with shops selling wool and silk textiles, gold and silver jewelry, and workshops for glass, bronze, iron, tin, and lead. His letter reflects his observation that professions that employ fire sustain our lives by bringing people to the city from across Greece, from the Balkans and beyond, to buy their products. Even the religious community of the basilica at St. Demetrios made candles in fixed sizes, which were then sold by the church guardians to the faithful, to the pilgrims. These artisans were professionals. They were making specialist products. There must have been a lot of menial work, too, stoking the fires for the kilns, collecting raw materials, shoveling out the stalls. The city was a place for work. I can point to loads of other examples. Naples had neighborhoods that were families of smiths, and they witnessed each other's documents. The origins of Kiev, in what's now the Ukraine, in the 9th century are workshops for iron metallurgy, blacksmithing, jewelry making, and stone and bone carving alongside a princely residence. Although professionalization of craft within an urban population, that is the creation of a sort of stratum of society that's distinct for what they do or make, cities also had minorities. Textual sources give us glimpses of these. So Gregory of Tours' history records the presence of Jewish and Syrian merchants in the cities of southern Gaul like Marseille and Clermont. At Cologne, there was also a Jewish population of a certain size, mentioned really briefly in the sources of the 9th century, and then there's some complex archaeology that's been associated to a synagogue and a mikveh, although there's some question mark about that interpretation. We see very little in the sources about them. It's hard to know exactly what these Jews are doing, but when we see Jews in the textual record and the archaeological record, we see them in the context of cities of the early Middle Ages. In the case of Umayyad al-Andalus, we have considerable evidence for minority confessional communities, both Jews and Christians, in cities. The majority of Iberia was, of course, under the rulership of the Umayyad emirs, and they became caliphs from the conquests of the 8th century. But it is important to remember that Islam is not the majority religion of Al-Andalus for probably about 200 years after the conquest. The process of conversion to Islam was slow, probably more attractive for urban elites than it was for anybody in the countryside, as urban elites stood to gain offices with the new regime. But Christians who were living peacefully in Dar al-Islam don't receive much attention in the sources. It's when they get in trouble, and we get notes about them in fatwas, in legal decisions, and in hagiography, that we can see Christians as the minority of Al-Andalus. So we have Latin accounts of the martyrs of Córdoba, 48 Christians who were mostly monks, who presented themselves before the Cordoban authorities as Christians, and they were killed for their crimes of apostasy or blasphemy around 850. In their accounts, there's a of Christians, Ecologies and Paul Alvarez, who give us a certain amount of information about Christian society. There were dedicated religious schools in the urban environment of Muslim Córdoba, which were inherited from the Visigothic period and continued under Islamic rule. There were, of course, churches, and Christian authors tell us about prohibitions about what the churches could do. Thus, there were limits on minorities in the urban ecosystem, and these limits were enforced more or less depending on the context. So Alvarez tells us that every night in their towers and high places, they, the Muslims, cursed the Lord through praising their own prophet. But when they hear the bell of the basilica, that is the sound of ringing bronze, which is struck to bring together the assembly of the church at all canonical hours, gaping with derision and contempt, moving their heads, they repeatedly wail out unspeakable things, and they attack and deride with curses. Not in uniform derision, but with 1,000 different infamous outrages, both sexes, all ages, and the whole flock of Christ the Lord. So, I mean, this is not an accurate journalistic account of what actually happened. This is a polemical text. It's an exhortation to Christians to assert their Christian religious identity defiantly. And it makes plain how people in cities operated in energized crowding, right? Within crowded and competitive environments, working hard to carve up us and them. The polyfocal nature of early medieval Córdoba, its schools inherited from a past now long gone, and its new Umayyad ruling court, this was a source of conflict. This is not top-down cohesion at all. The urban environment is highly interactive, or energized crowding indeed, and that's why there were rules over and discussed about religious noise. In the same vein, processions and performances like stational liturgies where the Pope rides a horse, or the slaughter of animals before the Pope for Carnevale, or royal appearances, those were key forms of medieval mass communication. So when John Philogathos, who was a rival to the papal throne in 997, was punished and exiled from Rome, our accounts report that he was blinded, his tongue was cut out, and he was put on a donkey backwards and processed through Rome as a parade of infamy. Now, the expectations that the rightful pope would ride a horse and that donkeys were pack animals conveyed his shame and Rome's derision. Urban punishment was public. We've got the fueros from Christian Spain, a fuero of Leon of 1017 that orders flogging for bakers who use short measure, and the same for fish and for meat sellers as well. These punishments were visible to urban communities who understood a common matrix. Which animals were used for what, and who was flogging whom, who was in charge and who had been disobedient. Now, I want to give you a sketch of how this can come together, of how the urban context can generate an ecology, which shapes how humans interact. I want to try out this idea for Rome, obviously. That's the place where I go with ideas about how cities work. But because so much of Rome was excavated in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, we just really don't have the data to do it. We don't have. There's been a very long habit in Italy of not collecting the bones from archaeological records, of not taking samples of soils, of not looking for the archaeobotanical records. So we just don't really have the data to do it, except in a couple of isolated cases. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to turn to Cologne, which in the early Middle Ages was a major city on the Rhineland, sitting within and without the Roman walls of what had been a provincial city and a military outpost on the late antique frontier. The Roman period economic system, which fueled it, constricted, as it did everywhere. So the population that lived here was much more regionally self-sufficient than it had been in the Roman city. In the 5th century, there was, in the city, manufacturing in metal and glass and fine jewelry. These were perhaps traded over distance. There was a regional market of agricultural products. And there was pottery. There was a distinctive pottery that was made near Cologne and circulated in the area immediately around it. And there was quite a lot of building going on in the city of Cologne in the early Middle Ages. The usefulness of a Roman military town was not lost on the Merovingians, right? So Clovis and later Frankish kings used Cologne as a royal residence, and the treasury, the praetorium in the center of town, housed the Merovingian treasury until the collapse of the Merovingian kingdom in the 8th century. The city, despite its age, remained a dramatic theater for rulers in the 8th century. It had a Cardo Maximus, which once ran parallel to the river. This appears to have endured, and it was paved and repaved with spolia in the late Roman period. Charles Martel, the sort of beginning of the Carolingian dynasty, was acclaimed mayor of the palace in Cologne. It was a ceremonial backdrop for kingmaking. We are fortunate at Cologne to have had the excavations of the subway system and of Heumarkt, which was a sort of river island, which was enclosed. You can kind of see there's a bit of, I hope you can see, there's an island that then becomes enclosed in late antiquity as that little bit of the river silts up in late antiquity. And in Heumarkt here, we've got extremely good excavation that tells us about how the city looked and felt in the early Middle Ages. We've got deep, deep, deep sequences of life, and they help us to see the preservation of some Roman monumental buildings and the hustle and bustle of new ways of living. We've got plants, we've got animals, we can tell who lived in the city and what was consumed by those people who lived there. So we've got tons of pigs. That's typical for Francia. We often so pigs were extremely good at converting milling scraps and table scraps, and so they're very, very commonly consumed in Francia. Pigs were normally raised in woodlands or in barnyards, but they were bred in Cologne, and they were herded in the city. In medieval Cologne, we also get a very high proportion of cattle that's butchered at adulthood, suggesting that there were traction animals that were being brought into the city, that there was perhaps an increase in agricultural activity around the city in the Carolingian period, for which these traction animals were used, and then they were killed in adulthood. But there must have been dozens of these pack animals wandering through the city at a time. Wild animals were also brought into the city for food or for craft. There's bones of auroch, a now extinct animal related to a deer. Red deer, roe deer, wolf, fox, beaver, probably for their pelts, have all been found in rubbish tips in Heumarkt. This mix of animals relates to the wider landscape. It also changed the city, as those animals produced waste and after slaughter became waste. They speak to the conditions of life at Cologne and the full cycle of production and consumption. So that same kind of thin section analysis by geologists of dark earth has taken place at Cologne as well. And this gives us, I think, a really clear picture of the intensity of life in the city. So in one neighborhood in the Forum, which I think is the one on the left, yes, we can see repeated dumping of household waste. Hearth ashes, chicken eggshells, fish scales. These are dumped in layers, compacted by trampling, by people walking on them, and then more of the same. So this is where people live and they clean out their kitchen hearths. These layers were gently mixed over time, perhaps people who were searching for recyclable material, like metal. And in the 6th century, we have areas that give a good indicator of metalworking. There's bits of slag and there's bits of sort of burn area, which suggests that people are doing metalworking there. And at Heumarkt, here on the right, we've got a different kind of domestic waste. We've got charred chaff from wheat, as well as phosphates indicating animal dung. And here, the soils were turned, which tells us that people had gardens. There's an awful lot of nutrient-rich soils, fertilized by latrines and animal dung, and there's an awful lot there of ruderal plants like nettle or nettle-leaved goosefoot. They thrive in frequently disturbed soils, and certainly in Europe, you can still see them on construction sites now. They like quickly turned soil. Now, Cologne continued to be strategically useful for the Carolingian kings as a major bishopric on the frontiers of Austrasia. Bishop of Cologne, Hildebald, who died in 818, was Charlemagne's arch-chaplain over 20 years. So when Charlemagne was crowned a Holy Roman Emperor in Rome, Hildebald was his chief chaplain. He founded a cathedral school and a library at Cologne, and we can reconstruct something of its collection from a book list that we have from the 9th century. And we can see, and you can see on the left there, that there were labels that he and others made in the manuscripts in their collection. Codex Sancti Petri sub Pio Patri Hildebaldo Scriptus. So this was a manuscript that was made under Hildebald. And several other bishops wrote that this belonged to the Cathedral School of Cologne. So we know a lot about this library, and it's the only library that we know about in Cologne. There's been an excellent German paleographical analysis on the manuscript annotations to these codices, which tells us this was a lending library of Cologne, so that the other churches of Cologne were able to use the books that were created in the archbishopric's scriptorium and held in their library. So dark earth, animal poop, farm animals, those don't generate necessarily a rich intellectual culture or a cathedral school on their own. But dark earth, farm animals, the royal residence, the cathedral library, these are all part of an urban ecosystem. The courts sponsored patronage of production, metalworking, parchment production, etc., but not simply that. The density and the variety of the population at Cologne and the competing and collaborating forces between the palace and the cathedral, they created a sense of awareness of place, an institutional and municipal self-consciousness that amplified and that projected the city and its inhabitants beyond their actual space. Rome, too, had some of this self-consciousness in the early Middle Ages. It was a polyfocal city, in that there was an ancient court, right, imperial court, which endured in some fashion into the Middle Ages, hosting emperors from Constantinople and their representatives, and the papal court as it evolved. And they provide complementary and competing centers. They each command resources. They promote architectural investment, artisanal production. They facilitate the circulation of goods and people and wealth. The population of Rome remained higher than just about anywhere in the Mediterranean until the 10th century. I'm showing you a map here of where cities were in Western Eurasia. And Rome is certainly the biggest of those until, as I say, the 10th century. It was less than it had been in antiquity. I mean, we can argue about numbers. There's an ongoing argument about what the population of Rome fell to. It might have been a tenth of the size it was under Augustus, but it was still bigger than anywhere else. With fewer people in Rome, the city's systems of production become more visible to us in the archaeological record, and there's more of it happening inside the city walls, especially as they took over shells of ancient buildings. And so some of the best evidence that we have, and Elizabeth will know this extremely well, comes from the crypta of the Theatre of Balbus, which was excavated in the 90s. We can see a metalworking shop. We can see traces of bone working, glass making, textile working, eventually a lime kiln for burning limestone in order to produce new concrete, new cement, and new mortar. These are all visible in the rubbish deposits which accumulated in the exedra of this ancient building, a huge, huge garbage dump in the center of the city. Now, Rome was, in this period, the place where people across Europe with very deep pockets or very large change purses or whatever they were, they could get the best stuff. They could get books, they could get silk, they could get ancient statuary, they could get little bronzes, they could get granite columns if they were Charlemagne and had the dispensation from the Pope. If they were lucky, they could get documents copied onto papyrus brought from Rome to Alexandria. I'm showing you a picture here. That's my son on the left. A few years ago, we were driving through Tournus, and he's standing next to a half-scale reproduction of a papal bull from John VIII to the monastery of Tournus, and I'm showing you an example of a fragment of it here. There are a few dozen of these papyri that were made as papal privileges and sent across Europe, and there's a few dozen more that we know about from the historical record of documents that are lost. But the papacy was about the only place that could get papyrus from Alexandria in Europe by the time this document was written. And you can actually still see the Arabic colophon that's on the very, very top of it there that was left visible to show that this was an extremely exotic piece of fabric material that came through the papacy to Tournus. And in Rome, the biggest city of all, you could also see bears as public entertainments, more than you could see them anywhere else. Now, the cities I've just discussed, like the expanding cities on the North Sea coastline, Riba, Birka, Dublin, and the cosmopolitan cities of Palermo or Thessaloniki or Constantinople, they were occupied by vegetable gardens, wood piles, as well as stocks of recycled glass and metal, treasuries and libraries, as well as royal episcopal monastic courts. Each of them had subgroups, different ecclesiastical institutions, different religious institutions in the case of the Islamic world, minority religions, neighborhoods of different artisans, emigres from somewhere else who kept their names and left those names in churches, and in toponyms. These elements of diversity altogether formed early medieval urban ecologies. These cities were living environments. They shaped the social practices of the realities of those who lived in them, human and non-human. What do we learn then when we become sharply aware of the dirt, the decay everywhere in medieval cities? I mean, none of you are going to be surprised that there was poop in early medieval cities, that they were muddy, that they were dirty, that there was extensive recycling. Those are all characteristics of urban ecologies. But what I hope to stress is that the strategies of power in the early Middle Ages were directly related to, dependent upon their material realities and the particular things that people did in given contexts. The goldsmiths of the Visigothic court cities produced the jewelry for elites all over the Iberian Peninsula. Their furnaces produced ashes, which made possible urban gardening for the dependents of the court. The bishops of Cologne held estates that raised the sheep or the calves, that produced the skins for the manuscripts. And when the manuscripts entered the cathedral scriptorium and were marked with the name of the bishop, their ownership was noted. And then those copies were passed around to other churches, creating a coherence of liturgical practice that actually brought about a liturgical reform in the 10th century. The papal court commissioned the import of silks and perhaps even the working of silk with imported material, at the same time as the secular court brought captive bears to entertain the people. The variety of material goods, as well as plants and animals, set the experience of these cities apart from elsewhere. Energized crowding, to use Michael E. Smith's term, energized crowding of differences created new ways of living for multiple species. So the case I'm making here is that the social and economic dynamics of early medieval cities is not simply top-down decisions, complex interactions instead. They were complex interactions of people, ideas, things, plants, and animals. Urbanism was a political choice, and it was a tool of governance. But it was not simply the choice of those in power. It also required the contributions and exploitation of workers, craftsmen, gardeners, merchants, animals, and certain kinds of plants. And these forms of life in cities really did include non-human life in abundance. Cities that were simply palaces or parade grounds, like Medina al-Zahra, I think of, in Al-Andalus, or Aachen, even, in Carolingian Francia, they didn't really survive beyond their initial construction unless they acquired further functions. So research makes clearer and clearer that intensification of agricultural production, specialization, and regional trade, these were the factors that profoundly reshaped societies and economies at the turn of the millennium. Urban elements were key to this too, as market cities, as Max Weber told us a long, long time ago, but not only. The kinds of self-governance and self-awareness that emerged in the communities of the 9th and the 10th centuries, and later in terms of guilds, communes, charters, hagiography, gestae, those were products of diversity, of multi-species diversity of the early Middle Ages.
So we have some time for questions. As you can see, we also have a microphone for questions. So if you have a question, you don't even have to raise your hand. You can just step right up to the microphone, and Caroline will field the questions.
Nobody wants to talk about poop.
Hi. In Córdoba, with the Muslim rulers and the Muslim society, what ecological niche that didn't have pigs, what did they use?
Well, you assume they didn't have pigs.
I assume, yeah, I'm assuming it.
Certain neighborhoods of Córdoba did have pigs, for sure. In fact, we've got really, really good archaeology from Segunda, which was one of the sort of suburb neighborhoods of Córdoba. And the prohibition on pigs was unevenly taken up across the Muslim world. I think we can say the more archaeology we have makes that clear. There are distinctions. One of the things that emerges less in Córdoba and more in Sicily that is distinctively Islamic are different kinds of plants. So we can see, for example, eggplant which comes from the east. That's one of the sort of classic imports of the Islamic world, and we can see those in Mazara, in Palermo, and I think we would probably, if we had the right context, we would probably see them in Córdoba eventually too. But we have latrines in Mazara that makes clear that people are eating plants that are grown from seeds or imported as preserved plants from the Middle East. We see them in Egypt, and then they arrive in Sicily in the 11th century.
Thank you.
I should say there's more. There's lots. It's not just aubergines, but there was an old idea about the Green Revolution that the Islamic conquests brought a package of distinctive plants, which is sort of true. It just doesn't quite happen in exactly the way that Watson argued that it did. But the more archaeology we get, the more we're seeing that there were. The table looked different in medieval Córdoba from medieval Rome, from medieval Marseille. Orella, yeah.
I was so happy to see the book, the manuscript of Hildebald, which reminded me, and I wonder if you know, that Pope Leo III famously sent a box of books to Charlemagne.
Yeah.
And we actually know that one copy of this, one book in this box was a copy of the Liber Pontificalis, this chronicle of the medieval papacy, of the early medieval papacy. And there must have been a copy of this book in that box, which was, and this book was then brought to Cologne, and it was copied. And we have a copy. One of these copies has survived and is still in Cologne today. So I was happy to see that, but also to emphasize the importance of Rome as a source of books and texts. And from that one copy of the Liber Pontificalis, we have an expansion of the copying of this book, and which is called the Frankish redaction, because it has details about the Franks. But in fact, it has details about the Franks because the Pope had commissioned a special copy to send to the Franks.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the Liber Pontificalis is a great example of that self-awareness, right? Or urban self-awareness that the Romans certainly had, that I think Cologne also had. And I think it's easy to say, oh, well, there's the Versus of Verona, which is a praise poem that was composed about the city of Verona. There's another one of Milan. Oh, all cities were doing this. All cities had the same degree of self-awareness. And I don't think it's quite as equal. I mean, Rome had a particular self-awareness, certainly in the time of Leo III, that stood above the others. And in part, that's not just papal invention. In part, I'd like to argue that had something to do with the materiality of Rome. I mean, you bring up a really interesting point about Rome as a source of books. It's true. People clearly came to Rome to get books or to copy books. But we know very little about what the library actually was. I mean, Rome. Yeah,
yes.
Yeah.
There are no manuscripts really.
It is if you're a medievalist, it's kind of a shocking thing to come to understand, right? That we cannot point to a book written in Rome that we know was written in Rome, that is transcribed or copied or even composed in Rome in the 9th century, right?
No, there is one.
Okay.
There is one that doesn't exist, but it existed in the 17th and 18th century. And so it was a print prints were made on some pages, and those have survived. So
Okay.
we know what this book looked like,
Right.
and it was a copy of the Liverpool.
Yeah, go figure, go figure.
Written in big ancho letters.
Oh, very nice, very nice. Well, I mean, Rosamund McKittrick has been doing a little bit of work on what the Library of Rome was, but it's always tracing back through things that we don't have anymore. But that it is that is a notable absence, I think. Yeah.
Thank you, Caroline. It was so wonderful. And I spent the day thinking about a donkey in Rome.
Okay.
So from the sublime to, and I'll have to talk to you about that. But I was curious about methodologies to deal with this problem of the excavation and sort of the building of Rome. And of course, you point to the Crypta Balbi as an exception. But what made me wonder this is when you showed the image of Florence with the dark earth. And that's also a city, I don't know, I imagine the excavation processes have been similar and it's very built up. So how do we have that image? What are some of the techniques or technologies that might be used or emerging to kind of work around some of these problems?
That's a good question and a difficult one to answer. I mean, the way we have that sample from Florence was because the Uffizi built a deeper car park. And so bigger car parks mean good archaeology. And the problem is in Rome, there's not a lot of that. Although now that I say that, I'm really curious about what happened, on the banks of the Tiber, sort of just behind the Via Giulia, there's that new underground car park. I don't know what the archaeology from that was. I don't know if it's been published. So it's a little bit... So whereas Boni and his friends in the 19th century went after what they were interested in, now we have to take what we can get in terms of where people are digging, where the city is willing to dig, where there's a need for a bigger car park or something like that. And so that creates an even spottier picture of what we can know. The intellectual habit of failing to collect archaeobotanical and archaeofaunal samples is something that we're just not going to be able to resolve. It just was not part. I mean, I learned to dig in Italy. We did not collect our animal bones. That's mea culpa, mea culpa, mea gravis, mea culpa. We just didn't do it, and that's changing now, but it's a bit late. Yeah. So what do I do? Well, I look for traces. I mean, you know this as well as I do. Good stuff can come out of retracing archives of excavations, and so people have done really good work looking back at Boni's notes to see what he took away. That doesn't help us with this sort of fine-grained sedimentary stuff, but it certainly does help us with structures and techniques of construction and those kinds of things. And yeah, fingers crossed, finding another deposit where you'll be able to apply a lot of these new methods, where you've got an intact stratigraphy. Yeah, so yeah, huge hopes for the Metropolitana, but yet to be revealed. I mean, and even revealing kind of very surprising things, right? So that whole little stretch on Via Ambaradam produced great archaeobotanical data from the 2nd century BCE, but not from the period that I'm interested in, because of, I don't know, because. So it's hit or miss, and I don't have a solution to fix that. Jeffrey.
I wanted to ask you a slightly different methodological question also about archaeology, but not so much about techniques, but about how you correlate it with other kinds of evidence. Because what I love about your talk and your work in general is the way you toggle between registers of, being able to deal with archaeological evidence, match it with texts, and the kind of big historical interpretations of flows of trade or goods, city to country. Are there, in preparing this talk, were there any cases of the type you have raised in your earlier work where the archaeological evidence and the textual evidence or the historical evidence sort of tell different stories that don't necessarily neatly complement each other, but even conflict, or the chronology is off? And, how do you reconcile that? Huge question, but a couple of examples if they come to your mind.
Yeah, okay. I don't have any great examples that come to mind of where it doesn't really work. I mean, what learning how to be an archaeologist taught me, among all kinds of things, was how to think about sample sizes and how to think about the nature of the information that you're bringing up. So this is a conversation I have often about rats, right? The nature of the deposits in which you find rat bones in the imperial and the late imperial period, those are not necessarily the kind of deposits that you're going to find for the early Middle Ages. So it may be, I don't think it's true, but it may be that the absence of rat bones is actually something to do with the formation of the archaeological record rather than the presence or absence of bones in them. And so I do a lot of thinking about what exactly is the archaeological context that produced that. So the cryptobalbi is a really, really good example there because you've got these huge, huge deposits. And the ones for the 6th and the 7th centuries were sieved, meaning you get everything. You get animal bones, you get coins, you get all kinds of little teeny tiny bits. But if you don't sieve, you don't get those things. Right? So comparing a sieved context with an unsieved context is not exactly equal. So I spent a lot of time cogitating about exactly what is the nature of the evidence that I've got in front of me. And the documentary record benefits from a similar kind of scrutiny, to be honest, figuring out whether or not these documents is this the one document we have for the whole of the 9th century, or is this the 20th document you have from that same institution? And you know, so they all, you really have to, what I love about this period is that game, right? Figuring out the complexity of the evidence and how you can actually use it. And at a certain point, you just have to trust me, right? At a certain point, like you don't want to see all of the comparisons of the sieved versus unsieved or the whatevers. At a certain point, you have to trust me on that. But it is a genuine problem, and it is a genuine problem that we as historians or people who work on the past, I think, all grapple with in our own way.
You're right to say that archaeology has taught you a kind of skepticism that you've brought to other evidence.
Or a very basic grasp of statistics that I never learned as a historian, right? Sure.
You know, I think that was such a great. We're going to stop on that note. I want to thank you all for coming. Everybody, if you like what you heard tonight, buy Carolyn's books and support the American Academy of Law. Thank you very, very much.